Some people spend their whole lives trying to look powerful, and some people spend their whole lives actually being it, quietly, without asking for a single thing in return. A CEO who controlled million-dollar deals. A single father in a worn-out jacket. One morning that was supposed to be the greatest day of her career. And 3 armed men who changed everything. She looked right at him and saw nothing worth her time. She had no idea he was the only reason she'd walk out of that building alive. If this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, the kind where ordinary people turn out to be extraordinary, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and follow the channel so you never miss what's coming next. Some of the most jaw-dropping stories are still ahead of you. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The morning started the way every important morning in Claire Whitmore's life started, with control. She was up at 5:15. Coffee brewed before the alarm finished its second ring. Charcoal blazer pressed the night before and hanging on the back of her closet door exactly where she'd left it. By 6:30, she was already reviewing the contract language her legal team had sent over at midnight. Sitting at her kitchen island with reading glasses she refused to wear in public and a legal pad she'd half filled with margin notes that her lawyers would have to decode later. The deal today was the biggest of her career. Not just in dollar value, though the number had enough zeros to make even her breath catch when she let herself think about it, but in what it meant. A full acquisition. 3 years of maneuvering, 2 failed negotiations, 1 near catastrophic lawsuit, and more sleepless nights than she could count, all of it coming down to a conference room on the 4th floor of Cumberland Federal Bank and a set of signatures that would reshape Whitmore Capital into something even she had only imagined 5 years ago. Claire was 30 years old. She'd been running her own firm since 26, built from a shell company she'd bought with borrowed money and rebuilt from the inside out. People in her industry liked to frame her success as surprising. She'd learned to treat that framing as fuel. She arrived at Cumberland Federal at 7:52, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, which was how she preferred it. The car pulled to the curb on Meridian Street and she stepped out before the driver had fully stopped. Heels clicking on the sidewalk with a rhythm that the 3 attorneys and 2 financial analysts trailing behind her immediately matched. She didn't look back to check if they were keeping up. She never did. The bank was one of those old downtown buildings that had survived every attempt to modernize the city block around it. Wide marble steps, brass door handles worn smooth from decades of use, high ceilings inside that made every voice sound a little more important than it probably was. Claire had always liked it for that. There was a solidity to a place like this that a glass and steel tower couldn't manufacture. The lobby was already busier than she'd expected for a Tuesday morning. A line at the teller windows, a cluster of customers near the ATM machines, a young woman behind the information desk who looked like she hadn't slept well. Security guard near the main entrance, broad shoulders, thick neck, the kind of stillness that came from years of doing a job until it became invisible. Claire walked through the lobby without pausing, scanning her phone for messages, already mentally positioning herself at the negotiating table upstairs. She was barely 3 steps past the main doors when she registered him. He was standing near one of the lobby's side walls, maybe 20 feet from the elevator bank, holding a manila envelope against his chest with both hands. Gray jacket, the kind that had probably fit him better a few years back. Work boots with scuffed toes, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, not in a styled way, but in the way of a man who'd been too busy or too tired to bother. He was looking up at the ceiling, at something she couldn't identify. A vent panel maybe, or a light fixture, with the focused and faintly bored expression of a man who had been called in to look at something that was probably not worth looking at. Claire cataloged this in about 1 second and filed it away. Repairman. Wrong floor, probably. Or waiting for someone to escort him to whatever back room needed his attention. She moved past him toward the elevator, and that should have been the end of it. The lobby had a small refreshment table set up near the elevator bank, a detail she hadn't noticed until one of the bank's client services representatives materialized at her elbow, smiling the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes because he was working too hard to maintain it. Miss Whitmore, welcome. Can I offer you anything while we wait for the conference room to be cleared? Coffee, water? We're on schedule, she said, not breaking stride. Nearly. Just another 5 minutes. The technical team is finishing. Fine. She stopped near the table and took a bottle of water she didn't need, mostly to have something to do with her hands, while Marcus, her lead attorney, leaned over her shoulder to make a point about page 14. She didn't see exactly how it happened. She heard it first, a short, surprised sound from someone nearby. And then the sensation of liquid hitting the edge of her hand, and worse, the corner of the papers Marcus was holding. Hot coffee, from the cup she'd apparently been standing too close to, or that someone had brushed against the table's edge. The smell of it reached her before the full reality did. Dark, spreading stain across the upper corner of the preliminary agreement she'd been about to take into the most important meeting of her professional life. What? She turned. The man in the gray jacket was standing 2 feet away, holding his now empty envelope in one hand and a paper cup he'd clearly already set down. His own coffee, she assumed, or maybe a cup he'd grabbed from somewhere nearby. He was already reaching for the small stack of napkins on the table. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was quiet and even, the kind of voice that didn't carry. "It was an accident, the edge." "Those are documents," Claire said. She said it flatly, not as an explanation, but as a verdict. Her eyes went from the spreading stain to his face, and she felt the irritation rise through her chest like heat. Not fury, exactly. She prided herself on not doing fury in professional settings, but something close to it, sharp and immediate. He'd bumped the table, or startled someone who bumped it, or reached for something carelessly. She wasn't sure of the exact sequence, and at that moment she didn't particularly care. "Those are signed documents," Marcus said from behind her, and his voice had a wounded quality to it, like he'd just watched someone spill coffee on his firstborn. The repairman, she still thought of him that way, didn't flinch. He didn't apologize again either. He picked up the napkins, knelt without being asked, and began blotting the paper from the underside. His hands moved efficiently. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste motion either. "I can have those recopied," the client services representative said somewhere behind her, and she heard in his voice the particular strain of a man trying to prevent a situation from becoming a scene. Claire looked at the man crouched by the low table, blotting her documents with paper napkins. His collar was slightly frayed at the back. There was something familiar about the particular stillness of his posture, not tense, just contained, the way people got when they had decided not to react to something, when they were choosing each moment deliberately. She noticed none of that, or rather she noticed it the way you notice background noise, as data with no meaningful category assigned to it. "It's fine," she said, though her voice made clear it wasn't particularly fine. "Get it cleaned up." He didn't answer. He kept working. She turned back to Marcus and they moved a few steps away, and she let herself be redirected into the conversation about page 14 and the clause her team had flagged at midnight. She did not say thank you. She did not look back. His name was Ryan Carter, and he was 37 years old, and he had arrived at Cumberland Federal Bank that morning because the building manager had called his shop at 7:15 about a ventilation panel on the ground floor that was making a sound nobody could identify. This was his life now. Not a complaint, just a fact. His shop was called Carter Mechanical, operating out of a rented bay on Fenwick Street, the kind of small operation that survived on commercial maintenance contracts and word of mouth, and the willingness of one man to answer his phone at 7 in the morning without making it sound like an inconvenience. He'd been at it for 4 years, since Emma was 6. Since he'd come home from the last of the several lives he'd lived before this one, and decided, with a clarity that surprised even him, that he was done. Ryan Carter had spent 11 years in the United States Navy, the last 7 of them in special operations. He had trained in conditions that were designed to break the average man, and he had emerged from them with a specific and practiced understanding of violence, of human behavior under extreme stress, and of the thin, unreliable line between order and chaos. He had operated in environments where the wrong read on a situation meant not coming home. He had been, by any professional measure, exceptional at what he did. He thought about that version of himself the way you think about a car you used to drive. Familiar, even fondly remembered, but fundamentally no longer yours. He didn't talk about it, not because he was ashamed or because it was classified. Some of it was, sure, but most of it was simply his, but because it didn't feel relevant to the person he was trying to be now, Emma's father. That was the job. Everything else was context. Emma was 10 now. She was currently in school on the other side of the city, probably halfway through a history project she'd refused his help with on the grounds that he always made it too complicated. She had her mother's stubbornness, and he suspected his particular talent for reading a room. She was funnier than he deserved credit for, and she worried about him more than a 10-year-old should. And the single most important thing Ryan Carter had done since leaving the Navy was make sure that she knew, in the way children know things deep and wordlessly, that he was not going anywhere. He had knelt by the table in Cumberland Federal Bank's lobby and blotted at the coffee-stained documents without anger because there was no anger to manage. The woman in the charcoal blazer had looked at him the way people looked at furniture. Functional, present, not particularly interesting. He'd absorbed the look and cataloged it and let it go, which was the only rational response. He'd noticed other things about her, though, the way he noticed things about people in any room. She moved like someone who was used to being waited on and had made the mistake of deciding that was the same as being competent. Her legal team shuffled in her wake rather than walked with her. She'd scanned the lobby when she came in, out of habit or anxiety, he couldn't tell, but she'd stopped before she finished the full sweep. She'd looked at the security guard, dismissed him, looked at the refreshment table, looked at her phone. She had not looked at the exits. He'd noted this the way a person notes the weather. Professionally habit, not alarm. He gathered the damp napkins and dropped them in the waste bin by the table and picked up his envelope and went back to waiting for the maintenance supervisor to come down and show him the panel they needed looked at. At 8:47, he checked his watch, not because he was impatient, but because timing had been a professional habit since his early 20s. The lobby was functioning the way lobbies do. People coming and going, the ambient sound of footsteps and muted conversation, and the mechanical tick of the clock above the teller windows. He'd been shown the panel, had a look, determined it was a loose fastener and not the HVAC sensor issue the building manager had feared, and was filling out his work ticket near the far wall when the front doors opened. He looked up because the quality of the sound changed. Most people entering a space in the morning do it with a certain directionality, a forward momentum toward wherever they're going. These three came through the door and immediately spread sideways, and that lateral movement, that fanning out, was the thing his body understood before his conscious mind had finished processing the scene. Three men, dark clothing. The one in the center carrying something under his jacket that he brought out as the doors swung shut behind them, and the sound that followed was the sound that Ryan Carter had spent 7 years of his life learning to respond to with a speed that felt, even to him, like something separate from thought. A shotgun, short barrel, pump action. "Everybody down!" The shout came from the one on the right, and the panic that moved through the lobby was immediate and total. People dropping, screaming, someone knocking over the display stand near the information desk, the young woman behind the counter going down below the counter's edge. The security guard near the entrance got one hand toward his hip before the third man was already in his space, fast and purposeful, and the guard went down hard against the marble floor and didn't get back up. Claire Whitmore was standing 7 feet from the elevator when it happened. She had a signed document in her hand and Marcus at her shoulder, and a meeting in 4 minutes on the 4th floor, and then none of that existed. She did what most people do in those first violent seconds of an impossible situation. She went still. Not frozen in the paralyzed sense, but still the way animals go still when the threat has already arrived and motion equals target. Her brain was running through sequences that didn't apply here. Her training was boardrooms and conference tables, not this. And what came out the other end of that processing was a kind of stunned blank, where useful action should have been. She ended up on her knees on the lobby floor with her hands raised and a weapon aimed in her general direction. And everything she had built, every negotiation she had ever won, every room she had ever commanded, reduced to this. The marble was cold and hard against her kneecaps, and she could not stop her hands from shaking. She looked across the lobby. Ryan Carter was on the floor near the far wall, positioned lower than almost anyone else in the room, which made no sense to her until she realized, without quite registering it consciously, that he wasn't cowering. He was watching. His eyes were moving in a systematic pattern. The gunman with the shotgun, the man now behind the teller counter, the third man pacing the space between the hostages with something in his right hand. the injured security guard, the young mother in the lobby's center who was holding a toddler against her chest and pressing the child's face into her shoulder. His face was calm. She noticed it because it seemed wrong, because her heart was trying to exit her ribcage and everyone around her was either weeping or gasping or doing the careful, minimal breathing of people trying very hard not to be noticed. And this man who had been blotting coffee off her documents 20 minutes ago looked like someone who was solving a problem. She thought, he's in shock. She had no other category for it. She was wrong. Ryan had a category for exactly this. He'd been in 5 situations that were operationally similar, different variables, same architecture of violence. And what his training had given him, years before it gave him anything else, was the ability to look at a room where everything had gone wrong and ask a different question than the one fear wanted him to ask. Not, how do I get out of this? But, what does this situation actually require? He studied the 3 men the way he'd been taught to study a target environment. The one with the shotgun, center of the lobby now, facing the teller area, was the most dangerous because the weapon in the position said so. But his hands were doing something Ryan recognized. Slight tremor. Grip too tight. He was running on adrenaline, which meant he was manageable if nothing surprised him and potentially catastrophic if something did. The man behind the counter was moving with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this or something close to it before. Professional then, or at least rehearsed. The third man, the pacer, was the unstable one. He had too much energy and not enough direction, and his eyes kept going to the front windows, which meant he was thinking about what was outside those windows rather than what was in here, which meant he knew the police response time and was already afraid of it. Ryan noted the injured security guard, breathing, conscious, hand still near his hip where the weapon was, too hurt to use it but alive. He noted the sight lines between the 3 gunmen and identified 2 points in the lobby where a person moving low and slowly would pass in and out of each man's peripheral vision. He noted the emergency alarm panel behind the information desk, and the phone handset that had fallen off its receiver when the desk attendant went down, and the fact that in the far corner one of the tellers had pressed herself against the wall and was holding a cell phone against her thigh, with the screen facing inward. He began to consider, not what he wanted to do, what the situation required. He looked across the lobby again and found Claire Whitmore's face, and their eyes met for a moment over the heads of the people between them. Her eyes were wide and her jaw was tight, and she was holding herself together with what he recognized as sheer will, the composure of someone who refused to come apart in front of other people, even when everything was telling her to. He looked away from her back at the room. He started working. The first thing he did was nothing visible. He shifted his weight slightly, changing his position on the floor in a way that looked like discomfort and was actually repositioning him relative to the pacing gunman's path. He did it slowly, the way people move when they're trying not to draw attention, and no one looked at him. The second thing he did, 3 minutes into the standoff, when the gunman with the shotgun was mid-conversation with whoever he was reporting to on the phone, voice raised, distracted, was use 2 fingers to push a small metal chair leg outward 4 inches from the base of the counter near the lobby's side corridor. 4 inches. Enough to become an obstacle that would force anyone moving fast through that corridor to check their stride for 1/2 second. Half a second was a long time. He was already thinking about the corridor. He was already thinking about what came next. But first he needed to understand exactly what these 3 men wanted, and how afraid they were, and which of them would be the most likely to do something that couldn't be taken back. Because the only thing Ryan Carter cared about, in the cold and practical center of everything he knew how to do, was making sure that every person in this lobby was still breathing when it was over. Emma was at school. She had a history project she wouldn't let him help with. She had her mother's stubbornness and his tendency to notice too much about any room she walked into, and she was 10 years old, and he had made her a promise the day he brought her home from the hospital, and he had never once come close to breaking it. He wasn't going to start today. He stayed low, and he watched, and he waited for the moment that the situation would require him to move. The man with the shotgun called himself Decker, though nobody in the lobby knew that yet. He'd used the name in a phone call, short, clipped, spoken toward the floor, and Ryan had caught it the way he caught most things in that room, without appearing to listen. Decker was running the show, or at least he believed he was. He had the shotgun and the center position and the loudest voice, and in the first 10 minutes of the standoff, he'd established a perimeter of fear around himself that kept everyone where he wanted them. He was competent in the way that rehearsed people are competent. He'd clearly thought about this, planned it, walked through some version of it in his head enough times that the first few minutes had unfolded with something close to order. But Ryan had seen competent people crack before. He'd seen men with more training than Decker and better weapons and actual combat experience come apart at the seams when the reality of a situation diverged from the plan they'd built in their head. The plan was always the first casualty. What mattered was what a person did when the plan stopped working. He filed Decker under manageable and kept watching. The second man, the one who'd vaulted the teller counter, hadn't given a name. Ryan had started calling him Wires in his own head, which was probably unfair, but the man had a twitchy, coiled quality to his movements that reminded Ryan of a badly spliced electrical connection, functional until the moment it wasn't, and then dangerous in every direction at once. Wires had the staff behind the counter sitting on the floor with their hands visible, and he was working through the drawers with the focused efficiency of someone following a checklist. He knew where the die packs were, or at least where they were likely to be. He'd bypassed the top 2 drawers in the first window and gone straight to the third, which told Ryan something about his preparation. The third man was the one Ryan was most concerned about. He'd been calling him Pacer in his head, which was entirely fair because that's what the man did. He moved in a rough oval through the center of the lobby, from the main doors to the halfway point of the room, then back, and his path took him past the cluster of hostages every 40 seconds or so. He had a semi-automatic pistol in his right hand, and he was holding it with the kind of careless downward angle that said he hadn't decided yet what he was going to do with it. He kept checking the windows. He kept checking his phone. He was counting something down in his head. Ryan could see it in the rhythm of his movement. And whatever the number was, it was making him more agitated with each pass rather than less. Pacer was the variable Ryan couldn't fully calculate, and variables you couldn't calculate were the ones that got people killed. By the 12-minute mark, Ryan had a partial picture of the situation's architecture, and he was working with what he had. The hostages numbered 23, including himself, 14 customers, 6 bank employees visible on the floor, the injured security guard near the entrance, Claire Whitmore's team of 5 clustered near the elevator bank. Claire herself was 11 feet to Ryan's left, kneeling on the marble with her hands in her lap rather than raised, which was probably a conscious choice on her part. A small reclamation of something in a situation where everything had been taken away. He noted it without judgment. The injured guard's name was apparently Sal. He'd heard one of the tellers say it in a low, frightened voice when they were moved. And Sal was conscious and had been conscious for the full 12 minutes, which meant the head wound was bad, but not catastrophic. He was holding himself still in the way of a man who had decided that staying still was the only useful thing he could currently do. His weapon was still in his holster. Wires had either missed it or decided not to worry about it, which was a mistake that Ryan was already thinking about. The woman with the toddler was named Patrice. Ryan had gotten this from the name embroidered on her work lanyard, which she'd apparently forgotten to take off, and she was doing an extraordinary job of keeping her child quiet. The toddler was maybe 18 months old, a boy with dark hair who was pressed against his mother's chest with his face buried in her collar. And he had made exactly 2 sounds in 12 minutes. Patrice was rubbing his back in a slow circle, and she was crying silently, the tears running down her face without any expression to accompany them, and she was not falling apart. Ryan had marked her in his head as stable, and stability was what he needed from the people around him right now. The teller in the far corner, the one with the cell phone pressed against her thigh, had not moved. Ryan had been watching her intermittently, and he was fairly sure she hadn't been seen by any of the 3 men, which meant the phone was a live possibility if she kept her nerve long enough to use it. What he needed to do, and what he was doing, was create space without anyone noticing he was creating it. He started with the small things. At the 14-minute mark, Pacer made his oval and Ryan shifted his position again. 3 inches, 4, using the movement of the crowd as cover when a woman near him adjusted her posture and drew Pacer's eye for a half-second. Ryan used the half-second. He was now sitting with his back partially against the wall and his legs in front of him, which looked like the posture of a frightened man making himself small and was actually the posture of a man positioning himself to move quickly and low without telegraphing the intention. At the 18-minute mark, Decker made his second phone call. He walked toward the far end of the lobby to do it, keeping his voice down, and Ryan used the 30 seconds of reduced attention to reach out and move a small metal wastepaper basket from its position beside the information desk to a point 2 feet further into the main corridor that led toward the back of the building. 2 feet. He set it down without sound. From the angle Pacer was walking, it was now in his path. Not enough to trip him, but enough to require a step around it, and that step would put Pacer's back toward the cluster of hostages near the elevator for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough for what Ryan was building toward. The emergency alarm panel was behind the information desk. The desk attendant, a young woman named, according to her name tag, Keely, was crouched behind it, and she had not moved and had not been directly addressed by any of the 3 men since the first minutes. Ryan had been thinking about the panel for the last 10 minutes. He couldn't reach it, but Keely could if she understood what she needed to do and if she had the nerve to do it. And from what Ryan had been able to observe of Keely through the gap at the base of the desk, she had more nerve than she probably knew. The problem was communication. He couldn't speak to her. He couldn't gesture without being seen. What he could do was get her attention through the one channel that was currently available to him, the floor. He waited for Pacer's next circuit, watched until the man's back was turned, and knocked twice on the marble floor with one knuckle. Quiet. Lower than the ambient noise of the lobby. Low enough that only someone on the floor and close to the source would hear it. A pause. Then, from behind the desk, the very faint sound of movement. He knocked once more. 2 fingers appeared at the base of the desk panel, pale and thin, knuckles whitened. He looked at them until they were still, and then he looked at the emergency panel on the wall above the desk, visible to him from his angle, possibly not from hers, and knocked once in what he hoped was a directional way. The fingers stayed still for a long moment. Then they withdrew. He didn't know if she'd understood. He didn't know if she'd be able to reach it without being seen. He put it in the category of things he'd prepared for without being able to control, which was a category he'd spent a significant portion of his adult life making peace with. He moved on. At the 22-minute mark, wires came over the counter. He had a bag that was partially full, and he moved to where Decker was standing in the center of the lobby, and they spoke in low voices. Ryan caught fragments. Something about the vault. Something about a manager. Something about time. Time was the thing then. They were on a clock. Decker raised his voice and addressed the room for the first time in several minutes. Is there a bank manager here? Branch manager? Someone with vault access? He was scanning the faces of the people on the floor. I'm going to ask one more time, and then I'm going to start making decisions nobody wants me to make. Silence for a beat. Then a man near the teller windows, mid-50s, pale, a stain of sweat at the collar of his button-down shirt, raised one hand slightly from the floor. I'm the assistant manager, Collins. But I'm not. The main vault requires 2 codes, and one of them is the branch manager's, and she's not here today. Where is she? I don't know. She called in sick. I found out this morning. I don't have a way to... You have her number. I have her number, yes, but I can't guarantee she'll... Call her. Decker looked at wires. Give him a phone. The calculation was happening right in front of Ryan, and he was running his own parallel version of it. The vault was the objective. The vault required a code they didn't have. The branch manager was not on site. They were going to try to get her on the phone, which would take time. And in the meantime, the police, who Ryan was certain were already outside, because 22 minutes was more than enough time for someone to have made a call, were making their own calculations about when and how to come through the doors. Police response to a bank robbery with hostages followed a rough, predictable pattern. They'd establish a perimeter first. They'd get a negotiator in position. They would not move unless there was an active threat to life inside the building, and they would not move fast even then, because fast movements in hostage situations created body counts. The negotiator would try to open a line of communication with whoever was running things inside, which meant Decker would be talking to someone within the next 15 to 20 minutes, and Decker talking to someone outside meant Decker was anchored to a position and a conversation and slightly less focused on the room. Ryan needed that window. He looked at Sal, the security guard. Sal was looking back at him. Ryan held the eye contact for a moment, then looked deliberately down at his own right side. at the empty space where a holster would be on a working security guard, and then back up at Sal's face. Sal's eyes were alert, clearer than Ryan would have expected given the head wound. Ryan lifted 2 fingers from the floor, barely, not a wave, more like a marker. "I see you." Sal's jaw shifted fractionally, a man deciding something. Ryan looked away. He didn't need Sal to do anything yet. He just needed Sal to know that there was someone in the room who was not paralyzed and that the paralysis was optional. This was also the moment he became aware that Claire Whitmore had been watching him. He noticed it the way he'd been noticing everything, like peripherally, cataloged, filed. But this time the data was slightly different because she wasn't watching him the way the other hostages were watching each other, which was to say with the intermittent, frightened glances of people checking that the people around them were still present and still breathing. She was watching him with a focused, furrowed attention that reminded him oddly of someone trying to solve a puzzle they weren't sure they had all the pieces to. Her hands had steadied. He noticed that too. The phone call to the branch manager went the way these things usually go when someone is making a phone call at gunpoint. Badly and slowly, and with a lot of tense, low-voiced negotiation on Decker's end that suggested the branch manager was either genuinely resistant or genuinely frightened or both. Ryan tuned out the content and focused on what the call was doing to the room's energy. Decker was distracted. Wires had gone back behind the counter. Pacer was making his oval again, but his circuits were getting shorter and tighter, the radius of his pacing narrowing, which was not a good sign. Narrowing pacing patterns in high-stress environments meant the person's anxiety was compressing inward rather than burning off, and compressed anxiety in a man holding a loaded weapon was the thing Ryan had been most worried about since the first minutes. He was 40 seconds into watching Pacer's tightening circuit when Pacer stopped. He'd stopped near the cluster of people by the elevator bank, near Claire's team. He was looking down at a man on the floor. One of her attorneys, Ryan thought, a young guy, couldn't have been more than 30, who had apparently made the mistake of having his cell phone visible. "What is that?" Pacer said. Not a question. The voice was flat and tight and too quiet, which was worse than loud. It's my phone. I wasn't... Give it to me." "I'm giving it to you. Slowly." The attorney, to his credit, moved slowly. He held the phone out flat on his palm, and Pacer took it without touching the man's hand and looked at the screen, and what he saw on the screen changed his face in a way that Ryan read immediately and didn't like. Pacer turned toward Decker. "He texted someone." Decker was still on the phone. He covered the receiver. "What?" "This one texted someone before we came in, or it went out at 8:52. Pacer's voice was doing something at the edges, a fraying quality that Ryan recognized as the beginning of a loss of control. "Someone knows we're here. Before the police scanner even... The police already know we're here," Decker said, with the careful, measured voice of a man trying to hold a situation together with the tone of his voice alone. "That's accounted for. It doesn't change anything. It changes if he told someone specific. If he told someone in the building, he's on the floor of the lobby, where is he going to? I'm saying someone in the building might have gotten warning." Pacer's eyes were moving around the room again, and now they weren't doing the mechanical scanning of a man tracking threats. They were doing the scattered, rapid movement of a man whose internal alarm was overriding his judgment. Someone could be making calls. Someone could be doing things we don't know about. Ryan watched Pacer look around the room and felt the specific quality of the moment shift. This was the part he'd been dreading. Not violence, not necessarily, but the escalation point. The place in a situation where someone frightened and armed starts looking for things to control, because control is the only thing that makes the fear manageable. He looked at the information desk. He looked at the base of it, where Keeley's fingers had appeared 20 minutes ago. He had to make a decision, and he had about 4 seconds to make it. Pacer's gaze was moving, and it was going to land on the information desk within the next sweep. And if it landed on the information desk with Pacer in his current state of mind, then whatever Keeley was or wasn't doing behind that desk was going to become the center of a very bad situation. Ryan stood up. He didn't stand up fast, and he didn't stand up tall. He got to one knee first, the way someone would if they were stiff from sitting on marble for half an hour, and he let the movement be obvious and ungainly and slightly awkward. He let himself look like a man whose knees hurt. Every head turned toward him, including Pacer's. "Hey!" Pacer's weapon came up. "Hey, get down! I'm not doing anything." Ryan kept his hands visible and his voice level and his body language somewhere between frightened and respectful, which was the target he was aiming for. Not threatening, not conspicuous, just a man who'd gotten up because his back hurt and was now belatedly realizing that was a bad idea. "I'm getting back down. My back. I've got a back thing. I should have said something. I'm sorry." Pacer stared at him. Ryan met the stare and let the silence run and didn't blink, which was a decision that looked like blinking would have looked calculated rather than casual. "Sit back down," Pacer said finally. "Already doing it." Ryan lowered himself back to the floor slowly, with a slight wince that was entirely performed. "Sorry, I wasn't trying to—" "Don't move again. I won't." He was now positioned with his back to the wall and his line of sight to the information desk entirely clear. He waited. 3 minutes passed. 4. Then, so quiet that Ryan might have imagined it if he hadn't been listening specifically for it. The small but unmistakable sound of the emergency panel clicking open behind the information desk. Not the alarm? Not yet. That would require a deliberate press, and Keeley hadn't pressed it yet because she was smart enough to know that the alarm going off right now, in this room, with Pacer in this state, would not improve anyone's situation. But the panel was open, and Keeley was there. And Ryan had a line of communication to the outside world that hadn't existed 7 minutes ago. He exhaled through his nose, almost imperceptibly. He looked at Claire. She was still watching him. Her face had changed in some subtle way he couldn't fully define. The blankness of shock was still there, but something behind it had sharpened. She was putting something together. He could see it in the quality of her attention, the way her eyes had stopped moving around the room and were staying on him. He looked away from her, back at the room. Decker had finished his phone call and was talking to Collins, the assistant manager, in a low voice near the corridor entrance, the corridor that led toward the back of the building, toward the vault. They were negotiating something. Collins was shaking his head slightly, not defiance, more the helpless gesturing of a man explaining a problem he couldn't solve. Decker's hand was moving, patient, for now. Wires had come back over the counter and was standing near the teller windows with the bag, and a look of someone who had finished the work they came here to do and was now waiting on other people to finish theirs. The situation had reached its interim state, which Ryan recognized as the most unpredictable phase of any standoff, past the initial shock, before the resolution, with everyone's adrenaline still high and the outcome still genuinely uncertain. This was when mistakes happened. This was when the careful plan started developing fractures because reality was never exactly what you planned for, and the fractures either got managed or they got catastrophic. He needed to do something about Pacer before the fractures got catastrophic. He needed to give Keeley a signal she could act on. He needed to keep Sal steady and visible. He needed to do all of this without any of the 3 men in the room understanding that the quiet repairman sitting against the wall with a bad back was the one holding the architecture of the situation in his head and adjusting it, piece by piece, toward an outcome he could live with. He thought about Emma. Specifically, he thought about the way she argued with him about history projects. Not the content of the arguments, but the face she made when she thought she was right, and he was being dense. That exact expression of exasperated certainty. He thought about it for approximately 2 seconds, let it settle something in his chest that had been coiling for the last 30 minutes, and then he put it away. Later. He had a room full of people who needed to go home, and a situation that was moving and work to do. He reached into the pocket of his gray jacket, slowly, with full visibility in case anyone was watching, and took out the work ticket he'd been filling out when everything started. A small rectangle of yellow paper and a stub of pencil. He looked at it for a moment as if checking something, which he was. The angle of the corridor, the position of the waste paper basket he'd moved, the shadow of the chair leg he'd extended 40 minutes ago. Then he put it back in his pocket and looked at the room and began making a new set of calculations. Because something had changed. Collins had stopped shaking his head. Decker was nodding, and both of them were looking at the corridor. Whatever they'd agreed on, it was about to become the next phase of the morning, and Ryan had approximately 60 seconds to decide whether that next phase was something he could use or something he needed to derail. He shifted his weight. He waited. He was already thinking 4 moves ahead. Collins walked toward the corridor like a man approaching something he'd already decided he couldn't survive. Ryan watched him go. Decker had a hand loosely at Collins's back, not pushing, not quite, but present in that way that communicated the options clearly without requiring words. Wires had come away from the teller area and was now positioned at the mouth of the corridor, blocking the angle from the lobby, which meant they wanted what happened in that hallway to stay private. Pacer stayed in the lobby. Ryan looked at Pacer, then at the corridor, then at the 6-inch gap in Wires' position that would close the moment Ryan made it obvious he was measuring it. He looked at the floor instead and let the calculation run in the background, the way he'd learned to run parallel tracks. One visible and passive, one invisible and working. The situation had clarified itself into a specific shape. Decker wanted the vault. Collins was being walked toward it. The two of them disappearing into the back of the building meant the lobby's power structure was temporarily redistributed, which left Pacer as the primary threat to 22 people on the marble floor, and Wires as the choke point between the lobby and whatever was happening in the corridor. Ryan had maybe 4 minutes before Decker either got what he wanted from the vault or discovered he couldn't get it, and the energy that came back into the lobby with him would be shaped entirely by which of those two things happened. He needed to be in that corridor before Decker came back. He looked at Sal. Sal was still conscious, still holding the careful stillness of a man managing pain. His right hand was closer to his hip than it had been 20 minutes ago, a migration so gradual that it had probably registered as nothing to anyone who wasn't specifically tracking it. Ryan had been tracking it. He met Sal's eyes and gave him the same minimal 2-finger signal as before. Present, aware, not yet. And Sal's jaw moved in that same fractional shift. Then Ryan looked at Wires. Wires was watching the corridor entrance, not the lobby. His attention had followed Decker the way a dog's attention follows the person who feeds it, which meant the room behind him had become, in his mind, a solved problem. Static, contained. Ryan cleared his throat. It was a small sound, deliberately nondescript, the kind of sound a person makes when their mouth is dry, which his was. Pacer glanced at him. Ryan looked at the floor. Pacer looked away. He waited 10 more seconds. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "There's a kid over there." Pacer turned. "What?" "That little boy." Ryan gestured with his chin toward Patrice and the toddler. "He's been quiet, but he's been crying. If he gets loud, it's going to be harder to keep everyone calm." Pacer stared at him. So maybe she can take him to the corner, further from the doors. He's scared of the doors." Ryan said it flat and practical, like a man reporting a logistical issue rather than making a request. Loud sounds from kids in a room like this makes everyone more nervous, makes this harder to manage. It was a calculation in 2 parts. First, Patrice and her son getting further from Pacer's immediate orbit was unambiguously better than leaving them where they were. Second, and this was the part Ryan was actually working toward, Pacer moving Patrice across the lobby would require Pacer to cross in front of the information desk, and in crossing in front of the information desk, Pacer would have his back to Ryan for approximately 5 seconds. 5 seconds. Pacer looked at Patrice and the toddler. Ryan could see him processing it, the annoyance of being asked to do something, the competing logic that a crying child would, in fact, make the room harder to manage. He was not a sophisticated man, but he was not entirely unreasonable, and Ryan had phrased it in terms of Pacer's own self-interest rather than human decency, which was the right language for the moment. "Fine." Pacer walked toward Patrice, weapon loose at his side. "You, take the kid. Over there, the corner." Patrice looked up at him with her wet face and her arms still wrapped around her son, and she nodded without speaking and got to her feet. Ryan was already moving, not standing. Not that, not yet. Moving in the way he had been trained to move when movement needed to be invisible. Weight shifting, position changing, the body resettling in ways that looked like the ordinary restlessness of someone sitting on a hard floor for 40 minutes. By the time Pacer had turned back around, Ryan was 4 feet closer to the information desk and sitting in approximately the same posture he'd been sitting in for the last half hour. He looked at the base of the desk, Keely's fingers appeared again right on time, and this time they were holding something small and flat. The emergency panel's cover, which she'd apparently fully opened. And Ryan could see from his angle that her hand was shaking. He knocked once on the floor. A pause. He knocked once more. The fingers pulled back. A sound. Very quiet. A breath or a word swallowed before it fully formed. Then nothing. Then, 20 seconds later, Ryan heard the faintest possible sound from the front of the building, a brief interrupted electronic pulse that lasted less than a second before it cut out. Keely had pressed the alarm and released it almost immediately, probably because she'd panicked at the sound of it, but it didn't matter. A triggered alarm, even a partial one, sent a signal. Somewhere in the police command post that was certainly set up on Meridian Street, a readout had just changed. Wires heard it. He turned from the corridor entrance and scanned the lobby. What was that? What was what? Pacer said. I heard something. Electronic. Ryan was looking at the ceiling. I didn't hear anything, Pacer said. Wires stared at the room for a moment longer, then turned back to the corridor. His posture had tightened. He'd heard it, and he wasn't sure what it meant, and the uncertainty had introduced a new layer of tension into his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Ryan cataloged this. A tense wires was a faster wires, which was relevant information. 4 minutes had passed since Decker and Collins went into the corridor. Ryan heard footsteps coming back. Decker came through first, and Ryan read the result of the vault negotiation in Decker's face before he said a word. The particular flatness around the eyes. The set of the jaw. Collins had told him the truth about the codes, or at least Decker believed he had, and the vault was inaccessible, and the morning's plan was no longer the morning's plan. Change of approach, Decker said to Wires. He said it like the words cost him something. Then he raised his voice to address the room. We're going to need someone to come with us. Voluntarily. Someone who can help us access a secondary storage area. He paused. If someone comes without making this difficult, everyone in this lobby is fine. Nobody gets hurt. The lobby stayed silent in the way that large groups of frightened people go silent, completely, collectively, the silence of people who have all simultaneously decided that being invisible is the best available option. Ryan understood what Decker was actually asking. He didn't need someone with vault access, but Collins hadn't been able to give him that. He needed someone to walk with them into the back of the building where the police couldn't see, where the dynamics of a 3-on-1 situation would make the next phase of his plan more manageable. He needed a body that could serve multiple purposes: leverage if the police made a move, additional pressure on Collins, and insurance during whatever improvised version of the original plan Decker was currently constructing. Ryan also understood that whoever volunteered for that walk was stepping into an enclosed space with 3 armed men who were now behind schedule, which meant elevated stress, which meant elevated unpredictability, which meant the probability of violence was meaningfully higher in the corridor than in the lobby. He raised his hand. Not all the way. Just from the floor, forearm up, the gesture of a student answering a question he wasn't certain about. Decker looked at him. You. I know this building, Ryan said. I was here to look at the HVAC system. I know the secondary storage layout, the maintenance corridors. I can save you time. Decker studied him. You're the repairman. That's right. You know the layout. The maintenance side, yeah. Public areas less so, but back of house I can get you where you're going faster than Collins can. He watched Decker make the calculation. The repairman was useful. The repairman was also, in Decker's working model of the world, the least threatening person in the room. No authority, no resources, no reason to be a problem. Ryan had spent 45 minutes carefully constructing that model in Decker's head, and now he was spending it. Get up, Decker said. Ryan got up. He was aware, as he stood, of the full lobby watching him. He was aware of Patrice in the corner with her son on her hip, and Sal near the entrance with his hand 2 inches from his holster, and Keely behind the information desk with the emergency panel open. He was aware of Claire, who was not watching him the way the others were watching him. She was watching him the way you watch someone when you've just realized you were wrong about what you were looking at. He didn't have time to think about that. He followed Decker into the corridor with Wires behind him and Collins at the rear. The corridor was narrow, 8 feet wide, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of a building that had been climate-controlled for decades. It ran from the lobby toward the back of the building, with doors on either side at irregular intervals. Ryan had been down it once this morning, briefly, with the maintenance supervisor. He'd done what he always did in a new space, walked it with enough attention that he could replay it later. He was replaying it now. 14 steps to the first branch point. Left went toward the secondary safe room. Right went toward the utility corridor that connected to the building's rear exit. The chair leg he'd moved in the lobby was no longer relevant, but the information he'd gathered from moving it, that these men responded to obstacles with annoyance rather than immediate violence, that Decker had more impulse control than Wires, that the hierarchy between the three of them was functional but not unbreakable, was relevant to everything that was about to happen. Left, Collins said, because Decker had looked at him. They went left. The secondary room was smaller than Ryan had expected, maybe 12 by 14, lined with filing cabinets and 2 fireproof document safes. No windows. Single entrance. The fluorescent light overhead was one of those that buzzed at a frequency just above imperceptible, the kind that put a low continuous pressure on the back of the skull after a few minutes. Decker was looking at the document safes. These. I don't have the combinations, Collins said immediately, and his voice had the particular quality of a man telling the truth about something he wished he could lie about. Those are the branch manager's personal codes. I have never had... Stop. Decker held up one hand, and Collins stopped. Decker was breathing slowly, deliberately, the kind of breathing that Ryan recognized as a man applying conscious effort to staying in control of himself. Think carefully about what you're telling me. I'm telling you the truth. I've worked here 9 years. I've never had access to those. If I could give you the codes right now, I would. I swear to you. Decker turned away from Collins and looked at Ryan. You know this building. Some of it. Is there another way into those safes? Access panel, override, not for document safes, no. Those are standalone units, no maintenance access. Ryan said it matter-of-factly because it was factually true and because being consistently accurate about the things Decker could verify was the foundation of being believed about the things he couldn't. But there's a data room 2 doors down, server access, backup drives. If what you're looking for is financial records or account data, that's a faster route than physical documents. Decker looked at him for a moment. Why are you being helpful? It was a fair question, and Ryan had expected it. Because I want to go home, Ryan said. I have a kid. I want this to end without anyone getting shot, and the fastest way for that to happen is for you to get something and get out. So I'm helping you get something. The honesty of it, the plainness, was itself the strategy. Decker had been dealing with Collins, who was terrified and therefore unreliable as a source of information because terror makes people say what they think you want to hear. Ryan was offering him the alternative, a man who was scared enough to be real, but not so scared as to be useless. Decker was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, show me the data room. They moved back into the corridor. Ryan walked ahead of Decker this time, which was a shift in the spatial arrangement he noted. Wires was behind Collins, who was behind Decker, who was behind Ryan. The order had changed. Ryan was now at the front of a group moving through a corridor, which was the position he'd been navigating toward for the last 40 minutes. He walked them past the data room. Not dramatically, not obviously. He slowed his pace at the correct door. He counted the rooms, knew which one it was, and said, "It's this one," and then kept walking 3 more steps while reaching for the handle of the door 2 rooms further down. "That's not the same door," Wires said. Ryan stopped and looked back. "Sorry, I'm counting from the wrong end. I came in from the other side this morning." He let a small embarrassment into his voice, the kind that was entirely plausible for a man who'd been in the building twice and was currently running on adrenaline and fear. He walked back to the correct door. "This one." Wires stared at him. Ryan met the stare and then looked at the door and held out his hand toward Decker in the universal gesture of a man waiting to be told what to do next. After a moment, Wires looked away. Ryan had bought himself the 3 extra steps he needed to verify what he'd suspected. The door at the end of the corridor, the one past the data room, had a horizontal bar handle rather than a knob. A push bar. Emergency exit. the kind that connected to an alarm circuit, which under normal circumstances would trigger when opened, but the emergency panel in the lobby had been accessed, and depending on how Keeley had triggered it, there was a meaningful chance the building's secondary alarm circuits had been interrupted. He filed this and went back to work. The data room was what it was. Server racks, blinking indicators, the background hum of cooling systems. Decker spent 6 minutes in there with Collins trying to understand what he was looking at and whether any of it was what he'd come for. And Ryan spent those 6 minutes standing near the doorway with Wires and conducting a quiet, thorough assessment of Wires' current state. He was not doing well. The controlled, rehearsed quality that Wires had displayed in the lobby was fraying at the edges. He checked his phone twice in 6 minutes, and each time he looked at it, his jaw tightened in a way that said the news from outside was not improving the situation. He shifted his weight more than he should have. His weapon was in his hand rather than holstered, which had been true since the lobby, but now he was gripping it differently. Higher on the frame, the knuckles of his trigger hand showing white. Ryan thought about the push-bar door at the end of the corridor. He thought about Sal's hand position and Keeley's open alarm panel and the specific training that taught a man to visualize an outcome before pursuing it, because the outcome you could see clearly was the one you could execute cleanly. And clean execution was the difference between everyone going home and someone not going home. He saw it then. The full sequence. Not perfectly. Nothing in a real situation played out with the precision of a rehearsed scenario, but well enough to know it was achievable. He needed a trigger, something that forced the moment into motion before Decker made the decision to force it himself, because Decker's version of forced motion was unpredictable in ways that Ryan's was not. The trigger arrived in the form of Pacer. Pacer's voice came down the corridor from the lobby. Loud, tight, the voice of a man whose compressed anxiety had finally found an outlet. Decker, we've got a problem out here. Police are moving. I can see them through the front window. Decker came out of the data room fast and moved toward the lobby, and the spatial arrangement reshuffled itself in an instant. Decker at the front now, moving away, Wires still in the data room doorway, Collins 2 steps behind Wires, Ryan between them. Ryan did not hesitate. He turned, not toward the lobby, but toward the end of the corridor, and he moved. Not running. Running was sound and reaction and the loss of control, but moving with the compact, purposeful speed of someone who knows exactly where they're going and exactly why. 4 steps to the push-bar door. He hit it with both palms flat, low on the bar, the way you hit it if you wanted it to open without slamming, and it opened into a narrow service alley at the back of the building where the mid-morning light was too bright after the fluorescent corridor. He was outside for approximately 4 seconds. Long enough to see 2 things: the police staging position at the far end of the alley, vehicles and figures in tactical gear, a man with a headset already turning to look at him, and the specific layout of the alley, dumpster, support pillar, open space, that he committed to memory before he turned and went back through the door. Wires was in the corridor, weapon up. "Stop," Wires said. Ryan had already stopped. His hands were up, both of them, and he was standing in the doorway with the alley light behind him and his face visible, and his body language doing everything it could to communicate that he was not a threat. "I was checking the exit, that's all. I was checking if it was clear." "Why would you need to, Because if they breach from the front, we need to know if the back is an option." Ryan kept his voice at the same level it had been all morning, steady, plain, without the kind of forced calm that reads as performance. "I'm on your side right now, I told you that." Wires stared at him. The weapon didn't lower. From the lobby, Pacer's voice again. "Decker, I'm telling you they're moving." And then from somewhere above them, a sound Ryan had been waiting for without letting himself count on it. The full emergency alarm, triggered not by Keeley's partial press, but by whatever signal the police had just sent into the building's system from outside. Loud, sustained, the kind of sound that changed the character of every space it filled. The alarm changed everything in the way that sudden loud sounds changed everything in enclosed high-stress environments. It disrupted every ongoing calculation simultaneously and forced every person to start over. Wires flinched. Not much, a small involuntary recoil, the body's response to unexpected auditory input, but enough. His weapon dropped 6 inches, and his attention fragmented between Ryan and the direction of the alarm and the sound of Decker shouting from the lobby. Ryan closed the distance in 2 steps. He didn't reach for the weapon. Reaching for a weapon was what people expected, and expected movements were defended against. Instead, he moved to Wyers's outside, right side, weapon hand, and used his left forearm against Wyers's elbow in a motion that was less a strike than a redirect, the weapon moving away from Ryan's center line, while Ryan's right hand came up to control the wrist. Wyers's reaction was to pull back, and that pull became Ryan's leverage. He let the momentum run, redirected it, and Wyers went into the corridor wall shoulder first with enough force to drop him to his knees. The weapon skittered down the corridor. Ryan was already moving toward it. He picked it up and put it in the back of his waistband and turned around. Collins was pressed against the wall with his hands up and his eyes wide and his mouth open. "Don't scream," Ryan said. "Breathe." Collins breathed. "The police are at the back of the building and they're about to come through the front. I need you to go back into that data room and stay on the floor and do not come out until someone tells you the building is clear. Can you do that?" Collins nodded. "Go." Collins went. Wyers was sitting against the wall, holding his shoulder, and looking at Ryan with an expression that Ryan had seen before on people who had just discovered that the version of a situation they'd been operating inside was not the actual version. "You're not a repairman," Wyers said. His voice had lost the twitchy quality. It had a flatness to it now, the flatness of a man making a reassessment. "I fix things," Ryan said. "Go sit in the data room." Wyers went. Ryan moved down the corridor toward the lobby. What he came back to was not the lobby he'd left. The alarm had changed the room's physics. People were on their feet who had been on the floor, not in defiance, but in the animal way that loud sounds make people want to stand. And Pacer was in the center of it all, and Pacer had come fully apart. He was moving in fast, short circuits now, nothing like the oval from before. His weapon was up and his eyes were everywhere, and he was saying things that Ryan couldn't fully parse because Pacer was talking too fast and the alarm was too loud. But the posture said everything that needed to be said. A man who had lost the thread of the plan and was now running purely on adrenaline and fear, which was the most dangerous combination available in a room with other people in it. Decker was standing near the corridor entrance, and Decker saw Ryan come out of the corridor, and Decker looked behind Ryan for Wyers and didn't see him. And something shifted in Decker's face that was more complex than the ordinary alarm he'd been managing all morning. "Where's Wyers?" Decker said. Not a question. "Sitting down," Ryan said. "He's not hurt." Decker looked at him for a long moment, and the shotgun came up. "You're not who you said you were." "I said I was a repairman. That part's true." Ryan kept his hands visible, and his voice the same as it had been in the data room. Steady, plain, managing the space between them the way he'd been managing everything in this building since 852. The rest of it you filled in yourself. "You think this is something you can handle?" Decker said. His voice had gone quiet, which was worse than loud. "I think the police are 40 seconds from the front doors," Ryan said. "I think you've got what you came for in the bag. And I think Wyers is sitting in a room in one piece. And I think if you put the gun down right now, the morning ends at bank robbery and not at something else. I think you're smart enough to know the difference matters." From somewhere outside, through the thick walls of the building, a voice through a loudspeaker. The practiced, measured cadence of a negotiator who had probably been waiting for a gap in the alarm to use it. Decker was still holding the shotgun on Ryan. Pacer made a sound that wasn't a word. Ryan watched Decker and let the silence do what silence was sometimes better at doing than words. Then Pacer moved. He moved toward Ryan, and the move had the quality of decision to it. Not panic for once, but something that had come out the other side of panic into a place that was colder and therefore more dangerous. And Ryan had the half second of reading the body language before the body committed. And half a second was what he had trained for. He stepped off line, left, away from Pacer's weapon hand, and the shot that Pacer fired went into the marble floor 3 feet to Ryan's right, and the sound of it in the enclosed lobby was enormous, a physical thing, and every hostage who had gotten to their feet went back down. Ryan had Pacer's wrist in both hands by the time the echo finished. He didn't fight the arm's direction. He went with it, up and back, using the leverage of the wrist rotation to take Pacer's balance. And Pacer went forward and down, and the weapon left his hand somewhere in the middle of it. They were on the floor for approximately 2 seconds before Ryan had him in a position that eliminated the threat without requiring further force, and he held that position and spoke directly into the side of Pacer's head. "Stay down. It's over. Stay down." Pacer was breathing in the irregular, ragged way of someone whose body had decided the emergency was finished before his mind had caught up. Ryan looked up at Decker. Decker was still holding the shotgun. And for a moment, a real moment, not a movie moment, a moment with actual uncertainty in it, Ryan didn't know which way it was going to go. Decker was not Pacer. Decker had more control, which meant he was capable of making a decision, and Ryan couldn't see which decision he was about to make. Then the front doors opened. The officers came in fast and low and in number, and the negotiator's voice was still going outside and the alarm was still going above them, and the room was suddenly full of a controlled, purposeful chaos that was entirely different from the chaos of the last hour. Ryan kept Pacer pinned and his hands visible and his voice down, saying, "Clear, clear here, we're clear," to the officer whose rifle was sweeping his direction. And the officer adjusted without pausing and moved past him toward Decker. Decker put the shotgun on the floor. He did it slowly, the way a man puts something down that he's been holding too long, and he straightened up with his hands out and his face carrying an expression that Ryan couldn't fully read and didn't spend time trying to. From the far side of the lobby, Sal, who had, at some point in the last 60 seconds, managed to get himself to one knee, exhaled audibly. One long breath. From behind the information desk, Keely stood up for the first time in over an hour, and she was shaking so hard that her teeth were audible, and she had both hands pressed flat on the desk to hold herself up, and she stayed standing. And from 11 feet away, kneeling on marble that had been cold and hard against her knees for an hour and 7 minutes, Claire Whitmore was looking at Ryan Carter with an expression that he did not have an immediate category for, which was unusual because Ryan generally had categories for most things. It wasn't gratitude, though there was some of that. It wasn't shock, though that was there too. It was the specific expression of a person discovering that everything they thought they knew about a room, about a situation, about a person standing in front of them was built on the wrong foundation entirely. The look of someone who has been doing addition with the wrong numbers for so long that being shown the correct ones doesn't feel like relief. It feels like grief for all the time spent on the wrong answer. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the officer beside him, who was speaking into a radio, and at the lobby full of people who were crying and standing and holding each other, and at Patrice in the corner who was still holding her son against her chest, but whose hand had stopped shaking. The boy's face finally turned outward to see what all the noise was. He sat down on the marble floor. His back actually hurt, it turned out. The thing he'd performed to cover a tactical repositioning was also, beneath the performance, real. He sat with his elbows on his knees and breathed and let the room be what it was, imperfect and loud and messy with relief. And he didn't try to stand up again for a while. He was so tired. Not from the last hour. From all the years of carrying the ability to do what he'd just done, moving it quietly from life to life, from the person he'd been to the person he was trying to become. There was no clean line between those two people. He knew that. He'd always known that. The training didn't leave you. The instincts didn't retire. You just decided what you did with them. An EMT was beside him, asking him questions, and he answered them. And across the lobby, another EMT was with Sal, and someone had brought Keely a foil blanket she didn't need but was holding anyway, and the morning light through the front windows of Cumberland Federal Bank was the same as it had been at 7:52 when Claire Whitmore had walked through those doors believing the day would end with a signature and a victory. It had ended differently. Ryan Carter sat on the cold marble and thought about Emma's history project. He was going to call her school as soon as they let him have his phone back. He was going to tell her he was fine before she heard anything from anywhere else. He was going to handle it the way he handled everything connected to her. First, completely, without letting anything else come before it. After that, he supposed, he would figure out the rest. The debrief took 4 hours. They did it in the bank's second-floor conference room, the same room where Claire's acquisition meeting had been scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning, which struck her with a particular kind of absurdity that she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to fully process until much later. The table was the same long mahogany table. The chairs were the same leather chairs. Someone had set out bottles of water and a tray of food that nobody touched, and the afternoon light came through the same windows at the same angle it always did. And all of it looked exactly the same as it would have looked on any ordinary Tuesday, which made the fact that it wasn't ordinary feel even more disorienting than it already did. She gave her statement to the lead detective, a woman named Okafor, 50s, unhurried in the way of someone who had learned that patience produced better information than pressure, and the statement took 40 minutes and left Claire with the hollow, slightly surreal feeling of having narrated something that she still wasn't entirely sure had happened to her. She told Okafor about the coffee, about the documents, about the way she'd spoken to Ryan Carter and the way he hadn't responded. Okafor wrote something down and didn't react to any of it, which Claire was grateful for. "Did Mr. Carter say anything to you during the incident?" Okafor asked. "Direct communication?" "He looked at me," Claire said. "A few times. I don't think he said anything directly to me, no. But you were watching him." "Eventually." She paused. "Not at first." Okafor wrote something else. "What changed when you started watching him?" Claire thought about how to answer that. She thought about the moment, maybe 15 minutes into the standoff, when the fear had settled from its initial acute peak into something more sustained and therefore more observable, when she'd looked across the lobby and noticed that Ryan Carter was the only person in the room who wasn't looking at the men with the guns. He was looking at everything else, the exits, the other hostages, the floor, the objects around him. He was looking at the room the way someone looks at something they intend to solve, and she had registered it as wrong before she registered it as significant. "He was calm in a way that didn't fit," she told Okafor. "I thought he was in shock at first, but it wasn't that." Okafor nodded. She didn't write anything that time. Ryan's debrief was in a separate room. Claire knew this because she'd asked, and the officer who told her confirmed it with the flat neutrality of someone answering a question they weren't going to editorialize on. She didn't see him again until they were released from the building at 2:15 in the afternoon, and even then she only saw him from a distance, standing on the sidewalk on Meridian Street with a cell phone pressed to his ear and his gray jacket pushed back by one hand shoved into his pocket, and his face had the concentrated private quality of someone in the middle of a conversation that mattered more than anything around him. She was almost certain, from the way his shoulders changed during the call, that he was talking to his daughter. She thought about asking someone to hold the car. She thought about crossing the sidewalk and waiting until he was done and saying something. She wasn't sure what. Instead, she got in the car. Marcus was already inside, and he had the preliminary contract in a folder on his lap, and the stain on the upper corner had dried to a pale brown shadow. He looked at her when she got in and said, "We can reschedule. The other side already reached out. They're being entirely reasonable given the circumstances." "Not today," Claire said. "Of course, not this week either. Give me a few days." Marcus closed the folder. He was a good attorney, and he had enough interpersonal sense to recognize that this was not a moment that benefited from further agenda management. So he looked out the window and said nothing, and Claire looked out her own window at Cumberland Federal Bank's wide marble steps, and the police vehicles still parked on Meridian Street, and the news vans that had arrived in the last hour, and she let herself be driven away from it. She did not sleep well for the next 2 nights. This was not a dramatic thing. She didn't have nightmares in the cinematic sense, didn't wake up screaming, didn't experience the specific crisis that her assistant had clearly been anticipating based on the careful way she'd been spoken to when she arrived at the office the following morning. What she had was something quieter and harder to name. She would be in the middle of something ordinary, reviewing a contract, eating lunch at her desk, standing in the elevator, and the marble floor would come back. The cold of it under her knees, the sound of the shot Pacer had fired going into the floor, and the particular quality of the silence in the room after it. And Ryan Carter sitting down on the marble when it was over. Not walking away. Not making a statement. Sitting down, elbows on knees, like a man who was finally allowed to be tired and had decided to be tired right there. on the floor of the place where it happened, without worrying about how it looked. She kept coming back to that. On the third day, she asked her assistant to find Ryan Carter's business address. Her assistant, who was young and professionally careful and very good at anticipating what Claire wanted without being asked, found it in approximately 20 minutes and printed it on a card and left it on Claire's desk without comment, because she had worked for Claire long enough to know when not to comment. Carter Mechanical, Fenwick Street. Claire looked at the address for a long time. She didn't go that day. She wasn't ready, and she knew she wasn't ready, and she had enough self-awareness to understand that arriving somewhere before you know what you're going to say is usually a way of making yourself feel like you're doing something without actually doing it. She spent 2 more days thinking about what she was going to say. She thought about the kind of person who walks into a situation like that lobby, not because they're asked to, not because there's anything in it for them, not because they've been trained and the training kicks in automatically, because the training had to be directed by something, and what it had been directed by was a decision Ryan Carter had made on the floor of a bank with a weapon pointed across the room, and does what he did. She thought about the methodology of it, the patience. The chair leg moved 4 inches. The wastepaper basket repositioned 2 feet. The way every move he made looked exactly like the move of a man trying to stay invisible, right up until the moves added up to something that wasn't invisible at all. She thought about standing in the lobby at 8:43 and looking at him and making her judgment and filing it and moving on. She thought about how quickly she'd done that, how little information it had taken. On the 5th day after the robbery, on a Thursday morning, she drove herself to Fenwick Street. She didn't take the car service. She drove her own car, which she rarely did in the city, and she parked it in the small lot next to Carter Mechanical's rented bay and sat in it for about 2 minutes before she got out. The shop was not much to look at from the outside. A roll-up metal door, currently open halfway, with a work van in the bay that had Carter Mechanical printed on the side in clean dark letters, the kind of sign that communicated competence without advertising it. Through the half-open door, she could hear the sound of tools and the particular concentrated silence underneath the sound of tools, the absence of music or television, just the work. She went to the side door, which was a regular door, and knocked. A girl answered it. She was maybe 10 or 11, small for her age, or maybe average for it. Claire was not good at estimating children's ages. With dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly escaped whatever it had been put into, and the expression of a person who had come to the door in the middle of something and was mildly inconvenienced by having to pause for this. She was holding a pencil and what appeared to be a school worksheet. "Hi," the girl said. "Hi," Claire said. Is Ryan here?" "Dad," the girl called without taking her eyes off Claire. She had a particular directness in her gaze that Claire recognized at a remove as something she'd seen before. The same quality of attention, just younger. "Someone's here." Movement from inside the bay, and then Ryan appeared in the interior doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was wearing a different jacket than the gray one, dark blue, less worn, and the work clothes underneath it, and he looked at Claire and his expression did something complicated and then settled back to the careful neutral that she was coming to understand was not his default, but his professional mode. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I should have called first. You can come in." She came in. The inside of the shop had the ordered quality of a space managed by someone who was precise about where things went without being precious about it. Tools arranged on pegboards, a workbench with a job in progress, a small table near the back wall where the girl had apparently been doing homework with a half-eaten apple next to the worksheet. The apple had gone brown on the exposed side. It had been sitting there a while. "Emma," Ryan said to the girl, "can you give me a few minutes?" Emma looked at Claire again with the evaluative, unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to make that kind of looking invisible. Then she picked up her worksheet and her apple and went through the interior door without protest, though the glance she threw back over her shoulder as she went said clearly enough that she reserved the right to form an opinion later. Ryan gestured toward the table and Claire sat down, and he pulled a stool from near the workbench and sat across from her with the cloth still in his hands and waited. She had planned what to say. She'd spent 2 days planning it. What came out instead was, "I didn't even say thank you when it was over. I didn't..." She stopped. "I don't know if you noticed that." I wasn't keeping a list, Ryan said. I noticed it. 3 days later, I noticed it. She looked at her hands on the table. I want to apologize to you, not for not saying thank you in the lobby. The circumstances were not exactly normal. I want to apologize for before that, for how I spoke to you about the coffee, for the way I looked at you. Ryan was quiet. I looked at your jacket, she said. Your boots, the envelope you were carrying. I made a complete determination about who you were in about 4 seconds, and I was completely wrong, and if I'd been paying any attention at all, I wouldn't have been... She stopped again. I'm not great at this, she said. Apologies, I'm told. Who told you that? Several people, over several years. Something shifted in Ryan's expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Was the apology for me or for you? He said, genuinely asking, not trying to be... Both, Claire said. Mostly for you, partly for me because I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I needed to say it out loud to the actual person. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. All right? Apology accepted. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he seemed to do most things. You're not the first person to make assumptions about what someone is based on what they're wearing. You won't be the last. It's a thing people do. That doesn't make it... I know it doesn't, he said. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying I'm not angry about it. A pause. I was a little annoyed in the moment, the coffee thing, but that passed pretty fast. She looked at him. You were annoyed and you still... Yeah, well... He turned the cloth over in his hands. The annoyance and the choice to do something about the situation are separate things. One didn't affect the other. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the building, she could hear Emma moving around. A chair, footsteps, the sound of a pencil being set down. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday morning in a place where work happened and a kid did homework at a table with a browning apple. Can I ask you something? Claire said. Sure. When you volunteered to go with them into the corridor, when you raised your hand, she paused. You knew what you were walking into, what it could be. You knew that. Yeah. Did you have to think about it? Or was it, I thought about Emma, Ryan said. It was a direct answer and he gave it without apparent need to dress it up. About what it would mean for her if I got it wrong. That's what I thought about for about 3 seconds. And then I thought about the other people in the room. The woman with the baby, the security guard, your team. He glanced at the cloth in his hands. I thought about the fact that nobody else in that room was in a position to do what I could do, and that a person either acts on what they're capable of or they don't, and the only version of going home that I could live with was the one where I'd used what I had. You could have been killed. Yes, he said. That was a real possibility. I'm aware. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not performing humility or courage or anything else she could name. He was just sitting on a stool in a work jacket telling her the truth. And the truth was matter-of-fact and human, and it had cost him something she could see around the edges of his eyes, in the slight tension that sat permanently in the muscles around his jaw, the kind of tension that accumulated over years of carrying a version of yourself that you'd decided to pack away, but that you knew was always there. What happened to your wife? She asked. It was too much. She knew it the moment it was out. I'm sorry, you don't have to... Cancer, Ryan said. Emma was 3. She doesn't really remember her. A pause. She has a picture on her dresser. I answer questions when Emma asks them, which is less than it used to be, but it still happens. He looked toward the interior door. She's going to be okay. Emma, she's tough. She seems it, Claire said. She looked at me like she was taking notes. Ryan did smile then, briefly and entirely authentically, the kind of smile that reached the parts of the face that performed smiles usually didn't. Yeah, she does that. Claire had come in with the apology, and the apology was done, and she could feel the boundary of the conversation approaching. The point at which she'd said what she came to say and continuing would become something else, something she hadn't exactly planned for. She looked around the shop again. She thought about her office, 22 floors up in a glass building on the other side of downtown. She thought about her team and her contracts and the acquisition that was waiting patiently for her to reschedule it. She thought about the shape of the life she'd built and how invisible its foundation had always been to her. How many people she'd looked at the way she'd looked at Ryan Carter, with that fast and airless judgment, and what she'd missed and kept missing. She thought about the woman with the baby and the young bank employee who'd opened an alarm panel with shaking hands and an injured security guard who'd spent an hour working his hand 2 inches closer to his holster, all of them doing something, all of them holding themselves together in a room where everything had gone wrong, none of them people she'd ever have looked at twice in any other context. She had a thought. She let it sit for a moment, the way she'd learned to let ideas sit before committing to them, to see if they had weight or if they were just the emotional urgency of a moment pretending to be substance. It had weight. "I want to do something," she said, "with the company. A program? I don't have the full shape of it yet, but I've been thinking about it since the day after. Support for single parents trying to build something. Skilled workers who don't have access to capital or networks because they're not inside the right rooms. Students who are working 2 jobs and still can't." She stopped. "I know what it sounds like. Rich CEO has a near-death experience, starts a charity to make herself feel better." "Does it have to be either or?" Ryan said. She looked at him. "It sounds like something that could help people," he said. "Whether it also makes you feel better seems like a separate question. The thing itself is either worth doing or it isn't. What you get from doing it doesn't change whether it's worth doing." She nodded slowly. "I'd want your input, if you'd be willing. Not as so I'm not trying to put your name on something for the optics of it." She said it flat and direct because it needed to be said flat and direct. "I mean, I'd actually want to know if what I'm building makes sense, whether the people I'm trying to reach would actually find it useful, or whether I'd be building it for the version of those people that exists in my head, which might be wrong." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read the look entirely, which was unusual. Claire was generally good at reading people in the moment, even when she was bad at giving them the benefit of the doubt in advance. "What would it actually involve?" he said. "Practically. Honestly, I don't know yet. A few conversations while I'm figuring it out, probably some pointed feedback on the parts where I'm getting it wrong." She paused. "I suspect there will be several." "Probably," he agreed without apology. She almost smiled. "So?" "I'll think about it," he said. "That's not a no. It's a genuine I'll think about it." "That's fair." She stood up. He stood up with her, the automatic courtesy of a person who'd been raised to do it. "There were other people," Ryan said, "in that building who did things. Keely, the woman behind the desk. She opened that alarm panel without knowing if anyone had seen her. She did that alone, scared, without anyone asking her to. The security guard, Sal. He spent an hour managing his own injury and staying conscious because he understood that keeping himself available was more important than..." He paused. "I'm not trying to be modest. I did what I did, but I didn't do it alone." "I know," Claire said. "I want to talk to them too, if they're willing." Ryan nodded. Something in the set of his shoulders adjusted slightly. Not relaxation exactly, but the particular shift that happens when a person discovers that the version of things they were bracing for is not the version that showed up. She picked up her bag and he walked her to the side door, and outside the late morning had turned the kind of clear and cold that felt specific to the aftermath of things. Bright, a little too bright, the way the light looked in the immediate hours after a rainstorm. She turned back at the door. "One more thing. The media. You haven't spoken to any of them." "No. They're not going to stop." "I know." "Are you going to keep not speaking to them?" He considered it for a moment with a seriousness that told her the question wasn't one he'd been avoiding, but one he'd already answered for himself and was simply summarizing now. "I don't have anything to say to a camera that's worth what it costs to say it," he said. "I have a business to run and a kid to pick up from school. The story they want isn't really about what happened. It's about having a story." Claire thought about the interviews she'd already declined, the statement her PR team had drafted and that she'd approved because refusing to say anything at all created its own narrative. She thought about the careful language of it, the appropriate gratitude, the appropriate acknowledgement, the appropriate professional composure. and how none of it had said anything true. "I gave a statement," she said. "I know, I read it." She paused. "Was it? It was a press statement," he said. "Not unkind. Not unkind at all, actually. Just accurate." "Yeah," she let out a breath. "Yeah, it was." She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment without starting it, looking at the rolled-up metal door of the bay and the Carter mechanical van inside it, and through the interior door she could see, at the far edge of her angle, the table where Emma's worksheet still sat with its browning apple. She started the car. She drove back toward the glass building on the other side of downtown, and on the way she called her assistant and asked her to clear the afternoon. And then she sat with her phone in her lap for the rest of the drive and thought about foundations. Not the foundation of the acquisition she'd been building toward for 3 years, which was still there and would still happen, but the other kind. The kind that held everything up without being seen, that you only noticed when it was under threat. She thought about a lobby full of ordinary people who had done what was possible with what they had, who had opened alarm panels and stayed conscious and held their children and stayed calm under conditions designed to make calm impossible. She thought about the specific and costly thing it was to be capable of more than the room expected of you, and to spend that capability anyway, without recognition, without calculation. She thought about Ryan Carter raising his hand. The afternoon light moved across the dashboard and she merged onto the expressway, and she let herself think, for the first time since it happened, not about what the morning had cost her, but about what it had given her. Not closure, not a lesson in the neat packaged sense, something less comfortable and more durable than that. The understanding that you did not have to know someone was extraordinary before you treated them like they might be. That the 4-second judgment was a choice, not a reflex, and like all choices, it could be made differently. That the man she'd dismissed before the day started had been, in the hour that followed, the most important person in the room. Not because of what he'd done in the Navy, not because of his training or his past or the exceptional version of himself he'd quietly walked away from, but because of what he'd decided, on a cold marble floor with a weapon pointed across the room, about what he was willing to spend himself for. It was a cold, clear day. She drove toward her office. She had work to do, and for the first time in a long time, she was not entirely sure the work she had was the work that mattered most. That uncertainty was new. She decided, deliberately, and with the particular stubbornness that had built everything she owned, to let it stay. The program didn't have a name for the first 3 weeks. Claire had a habit, when she was building something she cared about, of refusing to name it until she understood what it actually was, not what she wanted it to be, not the version that looked good in a presentation, but the thing itself. She'd learned this the hard way in the early years of Whitmore Capital, when she'd named 2 initiatives before they were ready and watched both of them collapse under the weight of the name's implied promise. Names were commitments. She'd stopped making them early. So for 3 weeks, it was just the work. Conversations. A lot of them. She called Keeley first, because Keeley had been the one she'd thought about most in the days immediately following the robbery. Not because of the alarm panel, though that mattered, but because of the image she couldn't shake. A young woman crouched behind a desk for over an hour, alone, holding a panel open with shaking hands and waiting for a signal she wasn't sure would come from a person she'd never met. Doing that without being asked. Doing that while terrified. Keeley was 24, and she had 2 part-time jobs besides the bank position, and she was taking night classes toward an accounting degree, and she lived 40 minutes from downtown because that was where the rent was. And she had been at Cumberland Federal for 8 months, which meant she did not yet qualify for the bank's tuition assistance program, which kicked in at 1 year. Claire listened to all of this over coffee in a place near Keeley's apartment on a Saturday morning, and she took notes not because she needed reminding, but because she wanted Keeley to see that she was taking notes, that the information was being recorded by someone who considered it worth recording. She talked to Sal next. Sal Reeves had been a security guard for 11 years across 3 different employers, and his shoulder had been partially dislocated in the fall during the robbery, and he'd spent 2 weeks in a sling and had returned to work before his doctor officially cleared him because the insurance situation was, in his words, a thing I don't want to get into right now. He was 53 and he had a daughter in her second year of nursing school and a son who was apprenticing with an electricians union and a wife who worked at a school cafeteria, and he had kept his hand moving toward his holster for 67 minutes on a cold marble floor while his shoulder sent signals his brain had learned to partially ignore, because he had decided in those first minutes that staying available was the only contribution he could make, and he had committed to it with his whole damaged body. He didn't talk about it the way that people talked about courage in the movies. He talked about it the way people talked about work, what the situation required, what he assessed he could and couldn't do, what the threshold was. He used the word threshold 3 times in their conversation, and Claire wrote it down and looked at it afterward. She talked to Patrice, who had gone back to her job at a pediatric clinic the week after the robbery, and who brought her son Darius to the conversation because she didn't have childcare on that particular Tuesday. And Darius was 18 months old and deeply interested in Claire's bag and managed to extract her phone and a pen and a folded receipt before she fully registered what he was doing. Patrice retrieved all of it from him with the automatic reflexes of a woman who had learned to conduct her entire life with one eye on a small mobile agent of chaos. And she said, "I'm sorry, he just..." And Claire said, "Don't be," and meant it. She talked to Collins, the assistant manager, who had walked into the back corridor with Decker and who had, the whole time, been telling the truth about the vault codes. He was 56, and he had worked at Cumberland Federal for 14 years, and he had been passed over for the branch manager position twice and was in the process of deciding whether to keep waiting or to accept that the answer was simply no. He was thoughtful and slightly formal, and he had a dry, careful humor that appeared briefly and unexpectedly at intervals in their conversation, and Claire liked him more than she'd expected to. She talked to 5 other people from the lobby that morning: a retired teacher who'd been opening a certificate of deposit, a young man who had just started his first job out of college and whose direct deposit setup had been interrupted by the robbery, which he'd had to reschedule 4 times after because the bank's reopening kept getting delayed. A woman who had been sending money to her mother in another state and who had, in the chaos of the morning, kept the transaction receipt folded in her hand the entire time. Not because it mattered, but because it was something to hold. Each conversation produced the same specific feeling in Claire: the sense of dimension. The way a person who is a figure in a crowd becomes, the moment you actually listen to them, a whole complicated architecture of work and worry and small daily acts of persistence that have nothing to do with anything dramatic and everything to do with how the world continues to function. She had spent her career in rooms full of people and had somehow managed to miss most of them. Ryan she saw 3 times during those 3 weeks. Once at the shop, where they sat at the same table and she walked him through the rough shape of what she was building, and he asked questions that were specific and practical and occasionally uncomfortable, the kind that identified the gap between what she meant and what she'd actually said. Once at a coffee shop near downtown, where Emma came to because it was a school holiday and Ryan hadn't been able to arrange anything, and Emma spent 45 minutes doing homework at the end of the table and listening to everything while appearing not to, and at one point said without looking up from her worksheet, "If it's for single parents, you should probably ask some single parents what they actually need instead of guessing." And Ryan said, "Emma," in the tone of a parent managing a boundary, and Emma said, "I'm just saying," and went back to her worksheet, and Claire wrote down what Emma had said. The 3rd time was a Thursday evening when Ryan had stopped by the address Claire had given him. Not her office, but a rented meeting room in a co-working space on the east side of downtown, because she'd been conducting all the program conversations away from Whitmore Capital's building deliberately, and Ryan had noticed and asked about it, and she'd told him it was so the people she was talking to didn't feel like they were being processed through a corporate system, and he'd said, "Good instinct," in a tone that was not patronizing, but was the tone of a man who was genuinely grading the answer and found it acceptable. By the end of the 3rd week, she had a name. She called it the Threshold Fund because Sal's word had stayed with her and because it was accurate. Not charity, not rescue, but support for the moment before the moment. The point at which the right amount of help at the right time changed not just a situation, but a trajectory. Tuition for the year you couldn't yet afford. Capital for the business that was viable but couldn't get a traditional loan because viable and bankable were not the same thing. Childcare support, while a single parent finished a degree. Bridging funds for the skilled worker who had the qualification but not the tools. It wasn't perfect. She knew it wasn't perfect. There were structural questions she hadn't solved, an eligibility criteria that needed legal review, and a board she hadn't assembled, and an administrative infrastructure that was currently a spreadsheet and 3 notebooks. She told Ryan this when she told him the name, and he said, "Imperfect and existing beats perfect and theoretical." And she thought about that for days. The reopening of Cumberland Federal Bank was scheduled for a Tuesday in late spring, 11 months after the robbery. The bank had undergone significant physical changes. The emergency systems had been redesigned, the sight lines in the lobby had been improved, new protocols had been implemented for staff, new training conducted. There was a ceremony. It was not a large ceremony, and the bank had kept the guest list deliberately tight, and the news coverage was modest compared to what it had been in the immediate aftermath. Claire was there. She'd been asked to speak, and she had said yes, and she had written her remarks herself and rejected the draft her communications team had prepared because the draft was good and professional and said nothing true. She stood at a small podium near the lobby's main entrance with the March light coming through the brass-handled doors and the marble floor, clean, the coffee table repositioned slightly from where it had been, but otherwise the same marble floor. And she looked at the people in the room. Keely was there, in the second row, with the kind of stillness that came from deciding to attend something you weren't entirely sure you were ready for, and then attending it anyway. She'd been awarded a full scholarship through the Threshold Fund 2 weeks earlier, retroactive to the semester she'd been trying to afford, and she still hadn't told Claire thank you in a way that felt adequate, which Claire had told her was unnecessary, which Keely had not entirely believed. Sal was there in the front row, shoulder-heeled, in a jacket and tie that he'd clearly put on with some ceremony. His wife was beside him, a small woman with steady eyes, who had the particular composure of someone who has spent years managing fear on behalf of other people. His daughter was there too, the nursing student finishing her second year, wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she was doing calendar math about an exam she had next week, even while sitting in the front row of this event. Patrice was there with Darius, who was now almost 2.5 and had evolved from a mobile agent of chaos into a specifically verbal agent of chaos, and who had already said, "That's loud," about the sound system, and "Where are the snacks?" loudly enough that the people around them had laughed, which had broken something in the room's formal tension that needed breaking. Collins was there, recently promoted to branch manager after the previous manager had quietly accepted a transfer to another location. He looked like a man who had received good news and was still in the process of believing it. And Ryan was there, near the back, not hiding but not centered, the same gray jacket he'd been wearing the morning of the robbery. She recognized it instantly, though she couldn't have said why he'd chosen to wear it today and didn't ask. With his hands in his pockets and his face in its usual expression of careful, reserved attention. Emma was in school. She'd made Ryan promise to tell her everything later. Claire looked at her notes and then put them face down on the podium. "I prepared something," she said to the room. "I'm going to set it aside." A small shift in the room, the attentiveness of people who expected one thing and sensed they were about to get another. "I was in this lobby 11 months ago," she said. "I walked through those doors at 7:52 in the morning, and I spent 8 minutes in this lobby before everything changed. And in those 8 minutes, I made about a dozen judgments about the people around me. Fast judgments, the kind you make without knowing you're making them, based on what you see in the first few seconds." She paused. "I was wrong about almost all of them." The room was quiet. I looked at a man near that wall, and I saw a repairman in an old jacket, and I moved on. I looked at a young woman behind that desk, and I saw an entry-level employee, and I moved on. I looked at a security guard by the door, and I saw a function, not a person. And I walked to the elevator thinking about my meeting and my contracts and my numbers, and I knew everything I needed to know about that morning. She stopped. I didn't know anything. She wasn't reading from anything now. She'd known since she put the notes down that she wasn't going to read from anything. What I found out over the last 11 months, not just from what happened in this building, but from all the conversations I had after, is that I had been doing that my whole career, walking into rooms and sorting people. Fast, efficient, confident. I was good at it. I thought it was a skill. She let that sit for a moment. It's not. Or it's not only a skill, it's also a way of making yourself blind to most of what's actually in the room. She looked at Keely, then at Sal, then briefly at the back of the room. There's a concept I've been thinking about for 11 months. I didn't have a word for it until Sal gave me one. She nodded toward the front row, and Sal's expression became, briefly, startled. He used the word threshold, the point before the critical moment, the place where someone either has what they need to do what the situation requires, or they don't. She straightened slightly. Sal had 11 years of work and a damaged shoulder and 67 minutes on this floor. And he kept his hand moving toward his holster a quarter inch at a time because being available was the only contribution he could make. And he made it. That's threshold. That's what it looks like when someone has spent years building something invisible, and then the moment comes, and it's there. She talked about Keely's alarm panel. She talked about Patrice holding Darius with her arms shaking and her face wet and keeping him quiet for over an hour. She talked about the retired teacher who had helped calm the two people near her without being asked, without being seen, without anyone ever writing it down. She talked about Ryan last, and she did it without looking at the back of the room, because she had a feeling that looking at him while she talked about him would make him want to be somewhere else, and she wanted him to stay. There was a man in this lobby who had every reason to stay on the floor, she said, not because he was a coward, the opposite, because he had already spent years being the person a room needed, at cost, and he had made a choice to put that version of himself away. He chose a quiet life. He chose to be a father and a small business owner and a person who answers his phone at 7 in the morning about a ventilation panel. She paused. He chose it. He wasn't hiding. He was just living the life he'd decided mattered more than the other one. She let that breathe. And when the situation required him to be the person he used to be, he was that person, without announcing it, without anyone asking. And when it was over, he sat down on this floor, and he was tired, the way a person is tired. And then he got up and he went home and he called his daughter and he showed up to work the next morning. She looked down at the podium and then back up. I built something because of this morning, she said. Not to make myself feel better, though I won't pretend it hasn't. I built it because 11 months of conversations taught me that the people who carry the most don't usually get to talk about it. They're at the threshold every day. One piece of equipment away from a viable business, one semester of tuition away from a degree, 1 year short of qualifying for benefits they already earned, one emergency from losing what they spent years building. They're at the threshold and nobody's looking because there's nothing dramatic about it. It doesn't look like a bank robbery. It just looks like a Tuesday. She picked up the note card she'd put face down on the podium. She didn't read from it. She held it. The Threshold Fund opened its first application 6 weeks ago. We have funded 31 people in the first cohort, a single mother finishing her nursing certification, a mechanic starting his second year of running his own shop, a night shift worker completing a trade apprenticeship, 31 people at their particular threshold with a specific thing they needed that they couldn't get from the systems that were supposed to provide it. She looked at the room. We're going to fund more. That's not a promise I'm making because it sounds good. It's a promise I'm making because I have the resources to make it. And I spent too many years making promises only to people who already had everything they needed. She stepped back from the podium. There was a moment of silence that wasn't uncertain. It was the silence of a room deciding how to respond to something that wasn't what it expected. And then Patrice started it, because Patrice had the practical unself-consciousness of a woman who was also managing a toddler and didn't have time for the social hesitation that preceded applause. And Darius joined in immediately because he had recently discovered that making noise when other people made noise was one of the better available options. The rest of the room followed. Ryan did not speak at the ceremony. He had declined when asked, and he had done it early enough and clearly enough that there had been no negotiation about it. What he had agreed to do was talk to the 3 journalists who had been given access to the event, briefly, in the lobby after the formal portion ended because Claire had asked him directly and because she'd said 30 seconds just so they have something to write that isn't entirely about me, and he had understood the logic of that. He stood with his back to the wall near the information desk, Keely's desk, though it didn't look quite the same, and he answered 3 questions. The first journalist asked him how it felt to be called a hero. I'm not the right person to answer that, Ryan said. Talk to the woman who opened the alarm panel in here. She did that alone, scared, with no training for it, without knowing if it would matter. That's the answer to your question. The second journalist asked him what he would say to his daughter about what happened. He thought about it for a moment. I did tell her, that being capable of something is not the same as always having to use it. That you get to choose the kind of life you build. But when the moment comes where someone needs what you have and you're the one who has it, you find out what all your choices were actually for. The third journalist asked him whether the experience had changed him. I'm a single parent running a small business, Ryan said. I don't have a lot of room for change in the abstract sense. What I do have is a daughter who is going to be fine, a shop that has more contracts this year than last year, and a pretty clear sense of what I'm working for. He paused. I went home and called Emma and she told me about her history project and I helped her with it, even though she told me not to. And she was annoyed and then she let me make dinner and we watched something on television and she fell asleep on the couch. He stopped. That's what changed, not me, just the understanding of how much that costs. The journalist wrote things down. Ryan looked at them writing and then looked at the lobby. He found Claire across the room talking to Keely, their heads bent toward each other in the way of a conversation that was real rather than ceremonial. Keely was laughing at something, and the laugh was the surprised, helpless kind, the kind that happens when something is funnier than expected. And Claire was laughing too. Not the controlled professional version of a laugh, but an actual one, slightly undignified, the kind that got away from you. He hadn't seen Claire laugh before. She was less composed when she laughed. He found this reassuring in a way that would have been difficult to explain. He thought about the morning. He allowed himself to do that, standing against the wall of Cumberland Federal Bank with the marble floor at his feet and the March light coming through the brass doors. He didn't do it often. Thinking about that morning in a sustained way felt like picking at something that was healing. And he'd learned long before that lobby that some things healed faster without his attention. But today seemed like a day for it. He thought about the 45 minutes on the floor, making small adjustments. The wastepaper basket, the chair leg, Keely's fingers at the base of the desk, Sal's hand. The way the situation had given him, piece by piece, exactly enough to work with. Not more than enough. Not the clean, well-equipped scenario of a training exercise, but the specific and imperfect resources of a real room with real people in it who were capable of more than they knew. He thought about the corridor, the weight of Wires' wrist in his hands, the push-bar door and the 4 seconds of alley light, and the police staging at the far end. The alarm coming through the building like a physical change in air pressure. He thought about Pacer's shot going into the marble floor 3 feet to his right, and the echo of it, and the specific quality of the half-second after. He thought about Emma's voice on the phone that afternoon. First the rapid tumble of words that was her processing fear at speed. Then the slower, more deliberate account of her history project. Then the comfortable silence of a car ride home where nothing needed to be said because he was there and she knew he was there, and that was the whole point. He was not a hero in the sense that the word usually meant. He had not been fearless. He had been afraid in the corridor and managed it because managing fear was a trained skill like any other, and he had done things in that building that he was not going to fully account for until much later, alone, when Emma was asleep. He was not invulnerable, and he was not exceptional in the ways that exceptional usually got described. He was a man who had learned specific things at significant cost, and had carried them into a life that rarely required them, and on one Tuesday morning in a marble-floored bank lobby had found that the carrying had been worth it. That was the honest version. Claire came to find him after the journalists left, which he'd expected, and she stood beside him against the wall, and they both looked at the room for a moment without saying anything. "How were they?" she said, meaning the journalists. "Fine. Reasonable." He paused. "One of them asked me if I was going to keep doing repair work." "What did you tell them?" "That it's good work and I'm good at it, and Emma's tuition is going to cost more than I want to think about in a few years, so yes." Claire made a sound that was a version of a laugh. "She told me I should add a mentorship component to the fund, for young people who are good at observing things and pointing out gaps. She's 10. She was right, though." Ryan considered this. "She usually is." He paused. "Don't tell her I said that. She'll use it." They stood there for another moment. Around them, the room was doing what rooms do at the end of events. The conversation breaking into smaller conversations, people gathering coats, Patrice lifting Darius onto her hip with the automatic ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Sal talking to Collins near the teller windows with the particular ease of two people who have been through something and have run out of ways to be formal about it. I keep thinking about something you said at the shop, Claire said, that a person either acts on what they're capable of or they don't. Yeah. I've been trying to figure out where that line is. For me, what I'm capable of acting on. She said it without the executive composure, without the professional distance, just a woman thinking out loud about something she hadn't resolved. I keep thinking I'm going to find a clean answer, and I keep not finding one. There isn't one, Ryan said. You just keep going, and you make the decisions as they come. And some of them are right, and some of them aren't. And the thing you learn from the ones that aren't is something you didn't know before, and you carry it. He looked at the lobby, the repositioned table, the information desk, the morning light on the marble. That's it. That's the whole thing. She was quiet for a moment. That's less satisfying than I was hoping. Most true things are. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the room still, his hands in his pockets, the gray jacket worn at the collar. He looked like what he was. A man who had somewhere to be later, and a lot of work to do, and a life that he had built carefully and protected fiercely and understood to be worth protecting. Not because it was easy or particularly recognized or impressive in any of the ways that his earlier life had been impressive, but because it was his, and because at the center of it was a 10-year-old girl who argued about history projects and stole his thunder at meetings with corporate executives and fell asleep on the couch watching television, and who was, against the weight of everything that had tried to make the world harder, going to be fine. Ryan, Claire said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. I know I said it before. I'm saying it again. You can stop after this one, he said. Probably not, she said honestly. But I'll try. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. And in the space between them, the CEO, who had learned to see what she'd spent years looking past, and the man who had never needed to be seen to know what he was worth, there was something that didn't need a name and didn't need to be bigger than it was. Just two people standing in a marble-floored lobby on a clear March morning, understanding each other correctly, probably for the first time. Outside on Meridian Street, the city was doing what it always did, moving, making noise, carrying its millions of ordinary lives forward through another ordinary Tuesday. People going to jobs that didn't look like anything from the outside. People managing their thresholds with the daily, unwitnessed discipline of those who have no choice but to manage them. People carrying things that the rooms they walked into would never think to look for. The bank's brass doors caught the morning light. Ryan Carter put his hands in his pockets and walked out through them, back into his life, back to the work that was waiting for him and the daughter he would pick up at 3:15 and the next version of the ordinary day he had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of the alternatives, above every other thing. Claire Whitmore watched him go. Then she turned back to the room, to Keeley and Sal and Patrice and Collins and all the rest of it, to the imperfect and necessary work she had committed to with both hands, and she got back to it. The marble floor was bright in the morning light. The doors swung closed. The city kept moving,